While the country was watching thermometers break records at Kew Gardens last week, something else was happening that barely made the headlines. The soil underneath those baking streets, those sun-scorched fields, and those drying riverbeds was absorbing the worst possible news. England just recorded its driest April since 2011. The country received just 38% of its long-term average rainfall across England as a whole during April 2026, with East and South. East England hit hardest. Half of all hydrological monitoring areas received less than 25% of their expected April rainfall. River flows fell at every single monitored site across the country during the month. Soil moisture deficits grew rapidly, and by the end of April, soils across southeast and East England were described in official government data as much drier than expected for the time of year. The heat wave that followed in late May did not arrive into a landscape that was coping. It arrived into a landscape that was already running dry. And the official warnings now building in the background of the warm weather headlines say this is not going to fix itself before summer begins. The data underpinning their current drought risk assessment comes from multiple official monitoring systems, and the picture they collectively paint is one of compounding vulnerability rather than isolated stress. The UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which publishes the monthly UK Hydrological Outlook, in conjunction with the Environment Agency and the Met Office, confirmed in its April 2026 assessment that river flows were widely below normal across central and southern England, with some catchments in eastern Scotland also recording below normal flows. The outlook for May projected that below normal to notably low river flows would persist across central and southern England, with the below normal signal expected to extend across the 3-month May to July period across large parts of the country. That 3-month window is the critical one. It covers the period when agricultural water demand reaches its annual peak, when public water consumption surges, when groundwater recharge essentially stops as summer evapotranspiration absorbs any rainfall that does arrive, and when reservoir drawdown accelerates from the storage positions that spring conditions have already compromised. The groundwater picture is more nuanced but contains its own warning signals. Groundwater levels nationally remained broadly normal or above normal at the start of May, supported by the wet January and February that provided late-season recharge after the severe drought of 2025. But that recharge was uneven. South Wales groundwater levels were flagged as likely to be below normal to exceptionally low through the spring, and a cluster of sites in southeast and East England, the chalk aquifer systems that supply drinking water to millions of people across London, Essex, Kent, and Bedfordshire, showed declining recharge rates as the dry March and April progressively cut off the late-season replenishment that these systems depend on. Chalk aquifers are slow-responding systems that take weeks to months to register changes in surface rainfall, which means the effect of the dry spring on deep groundwater will not be fully visible in monitoring data until summer is already underway. By the time borehole levels in the E, Chilterns, or the North Downs begin dropping toward concern thresholds, the situation that produced that drop will be months old and months more difficult to reverse. The reservoir picture is the one element of the current assessment that contains some reassurance, but it comes with a critical qualifier. England as a whole ended April 2026 with reservoir storage slightly above average for the time of year, a position that reflects the substantial winter recharge that took place across January and February after the extremely dry and hot 2025. That winter recharge brought England to its first drought-free status since May 2025 by late January 2026. The reservoir buffer that winter delivered is real, and it means the country is not entering the 22-26 summer from the same position of extreme deficit it occupied entering the 2025 summer, when Yorkshire reservoirs were at 30% capacity and hosepipe bans were affecting 9 million people. But reservoir storage was already beginning to fall by the end of April, as the dry spring accelerated drawdown faster than the seasonal norm, and the heat wave of late May, which drove public water demand to levels that overwhelmed Southeast Water's distribution network in parts of Kent and Sussex, will have accelerated that drawdown further. The starting position may be better than 2025. The trajectory from that starting position, in the absence of significant June rainfall, is heading in the same direction. The regional variation in the current drought picture is stark. The Environment Agency's April 2026 water situation report identified East and Southeast England as the areas of greatest immediate concern, noting that these regions had just recorded their driest April since 2011. East Anglia, which is Britain's most intensively farmed agricultural region and the area most dependent on summer irrigation for its cereal, vegetable and sugar beet crops, entered May with soils described as much drier than expected, and river flows at or below normal across almost all monitored catchments. The River Burn in North Norfolk was already flagged as below normal at the start of the year, and the dry spring has extended below normal flow conditions across a broader network of rivers in the region. Farmers in Cambridgeshire were already being warned by their county council in April that existing water supplies may struggle to meet future agricultural and household demand. A $1.38 million local authority scheme to help farmers improve water efficiency was launched in the county before the spring was even complete, not as a precautionary measure for some hypothetical future dry year, but as an immediate response to conditions already developing. The agricultural implications of a drought developing from this spring baseline are significant and poorly understood by anyone who does not follow farming data closely. Britain grows a substantial proportion of its food domestically, with the arable sector concentrated heavily in exactly the regions where dry conditions are already most advanced. Cereal crops, which cover millions of hectares across East Anglia, the East Midlands, and Yorkshire, entered the critical tillering and stem extension phase of their development during a spring that delivered well below average rainfall. Crops under moisture, stressed during stem extension, produce smaller grain heads and lower yields. The 2025 drought year demonstrated this effect dramatically, with cereal yields falling below the 10-year average across multiple regions. The 2026 spring is tracking the early stages of a similar pattern. The National Farmers Union has been warning since the environment agencies. November 2025, drought prospects report that the sector is entering 2026 in a vulnerable position, and that continued dry conditions through spring and early summer would have direct consequences for domestic food production that will not be fully visible until the harvest figures are published in autumn. The water company response to the developing situation has been more visible this time than in comparable periods before previous drought years. Anglian water, which supplies the driest part of England and which remained at drought level 1 in several supply zones through the winter following the 2025 drought, has been operating under enhanced monitoring protocols since January 2026. Southern Water and Thames Water have both accelerated leakage reduction programs in response to the below-average spring rainfall, recognizing that every liter lost through aging pipe infrastructure before it reaches a tap is a liter that cannot be replaced without additional abstraction from already stressed rivers and aquifers. Southeast Water's distribution failures during the May heatwave, which left around 500 properties in Kent and Sussex without reliable water supply, and required the company to distribute bottled water to affected households, illustrated in immediate and practical terms how thin the operational margins in water distribution become when demand spikes and the underlying network is already working at close to its limits. The Environment Agency's November 2025 Drought Prospects Report, which explicitly warned that England would face drought in 2026 unless winter rainfall reached 100% of the long-term average, laid out the risk scenarios with unusual clarity. Under a scenario where winter rainfall reached only 80% of the long-term average, larger swaths from Wessex to Yorkshire would be in drought by spring 2026. Under the worst-case scenario of just 60% of average winter rainfall, all of England would be in drought by the start of spring. The actual winter that arrived delivered close to average rainfall in most regions, with a particularly wet January and February that prevented the worst-case scenario from materializing. But the report's warning about residual risks in East and Southeast England proved accurate. Even with average winter rainfall nationally, parts of Cambridgeshire and Bedfordshire were projected to remain below normal by March 2026, and the government's own April 2026 water situation data confirms that these projections were correct. The recovery was partial, and the dry spring that followed eroded much of what the wet winter had delivered. The 3-month forecast picture for May to July 2026 contains a specific signal that adds urgency to everything else in this picture. The Met Office's seasonal outlook, which feeds into the UK hydrological outlook, identified a higher than normal chance of a hot May to July period across the UK. The forecast explicitly noted that increased chances of warm temperatures were very likely to continue across the 3-month window. That heat signal matters for drought risk in a specific and measurable way. Every degree of above-average temperature accelerates evapotranspiration, the combined process by which vegetation draws water from the soil and releases it to the atmosphere, and by which open water surfaces evaporate directly. A hot summer on top of a dry spring produces a faster soil moisture deficit trajectory than the same rainfall total would generate in a cooler season. The 2022 drought year demonstrated this compounding effect. The spring of 2022 was not dramatically dry, but the exceptional heat of the summer drove evapotranspiration rates so far above normal that soils and rivers dried out faster than at any point since the 1976 drought that remains the benchmark of British water scarcity. The 2026 spring is starting from a drier baseline than 2022 spring, and it is heading into a summer that the seasonal forecast explicitly flags as likely to be hot. The wildfire dimension of this picture rarely gets adequate attention in drought coverage. The UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology's April 2025 blog, tracking conditions that were directly comparable to the current situation, noted that the combination of dry conditions and warmer than average temperatures was already producing a higher than usual number of wildfires for that time of year across Cumbria, Derbyshire, and Dorset. The summer of 2025 went on to produce 996 wildfire incidents by the start of September, exceeding the previous record set in 2022. Dry vegetation on moorland, grassland, and woodland created by spring and summer rainfall deficits is the primary fuel for these events. The current trajectory, if sustained into summer, will produce the same conditions that preceded those records. The Environment Agency's drought scenario modeling explicitly listed increased wildfire risk as one of the direct consequences of drought developing from the current starting point. There is one important distinction between where the UK currently stands and where it stood in the equivalent period of 2025. The 2025 drought developed from a spring that was the driest in 132 years, with England receiving just 25% of its average March rainfall and 51% of its average April rainfall in 2025. The 2026 figures, 38% of average April rainfall, are severe, but not at the same historical extreme as the 2025 readings. The winter recharge that preceded 2026's spring also means reservoir levels are entering the dry season from a stronger position than they occupied in early 2025. What the current situation represents is not a certain repeat of 2025's full drought emergency. It represents a growing risk that will materialize into crisis conditions if June and July fail to deliver the rainfall that a dry April and a record-breaking May heatwave have made increasingly necessary. The Environment Agency's Helen Wakeham said last November, in words that remain directly applicable today, that the severity of any drought would depend both on the weather and the actions taken. The weather for the first 5 months of 2026 has pushed the risk closer to the edge. What happens next depends on what the atmosphere delivers, and on whether the country is paying enough attention to notice before it is too late to act.